Trapped Beneath the Sea, a true deep-sea horror story. On the morning of August 12, 2000, the icy stillness of the Barents Sea was broken by the presence of 33 of Russia's most elite naval warships. This was no ordinary deployment. These vessels had gathered in this remote stretch of water, tucked deep within the Arctic Circle, just northwest of Russia, for one of the largest naval training exercises the Russian Navy had ever conducted. The Barents Sea is a cold, hostile place, an 800-mile-wide stretch of unforgiving water known for its frigid temperatures and desolate isolation. But that morning, it was buzzing with activity. Ships cruised in formation, sonar pulses echoed beneath the surface, and deep in the water, submarines maneuvered silently in a mock battle. The goal of this exercise was simple on the surface: simulate warfare. In this controlled chaos, one ship would play the role of an enemy combatant. The others would track it, lock on, and fire dummy weapons. Torpedoes that looked and sounded real, but were filled with inert materials. No warheads, no explosions, just practice. At around 9 o'clock a.m., Admiral Vyacheslav Popov, the man in charge of the entire operation, gave the green light from aboard one of the ships. He authorized one of Russia's most advanced submarines to begin its maneuver. That submarine was the K-141 Kursk, a massive nuclear-powered vessel and the pride of the Russian fleet. The Kursk launched 2 dummy torpedoes toward its assigned target, initiating the start of the multi-day exercise. As the hours passed, the operation unfolded just as planned. Above the surface, the fleet moved smoothly. Below, the submarines performed their drills, unseen and unheard, until something changed. By the next morning, August 13th, 24 hours into the operation, Admiral Popov briefly stepped away from the command deck to take a phone call with Russian journalists. He confidently told reporters the exercise was going flawlessly and was expected to be a resounding success. But even as those words left his mouth, rumors were beginning to spread. Rumors that something had gone terribly wrong. Back on shore, far from the icy waters of the Arctic, the families of the sailors involved in the exercise began to hear whispers. Something had happened to one of the ships. No one could say exactly what. There was no official statement, no names, no details, just a growing sense of dread. Worried and desperate, family members began calling the naval base from which the ships had deployed. At first, they were reassured. No issues, the base operator told them. All is proceeding normally. But as the morning wore on, the story began to crack. One operator, perhaps overwhelmed or rattled, let something slip. Yes, they admitted, they too had heard the rumors. Something may have gone wrong. When pressed for more details, the operator clammed up. "I can't say anything more," they whispered, and hung up the phone. One of the family members, who had made such a call, immediately reached out to the media, unable to bear the silence. Soon, journalists were pressing the Navy for answers. They went directly to Admiral Popov with urgent questions. What happened? Which ship is in trouble? Are the crews safe? Popov did not respond. Not a word. No denials, no confirmations. Just silence. And strangely, that silence, at first, brought comfort to some families. If the Admiral was still aboard one of the ships, still running the exercise, and ignoring the press, then surely nothing too serious could have happened. Surely their loved ones were safe. For the rest of that Sunday, the public, the press, and the families waited. There were no updates, no leaks, and no news. Just an aching void of information. But by Monday, August 14th, exactly 48 hours after the training exercise had begun, the silence finally broke. Russian officials appeared on national television with a vague and cautious statement. Yes, they admitted, there had been an incident. The Kursk, one of the submarines participating in the exercise, had experienced a technical malfunction. The malfunction had forced the vessel to settle on the seafloor, somewhere beneath the dark, freezing waters of the Barents Sea. But there was no need to panic, the officials insisted. "We are in contact with the crew. We're pumping in air and electricity. All systems are under control. Rescue efforts are underway. Everyone is alive. They assured the public and the families that there was nothing to worry about. But for those who had loved ones aboard the Kursk, the official tone of calm did little to ease the rising sense of horror. Because even if the Kursk crew was alive, they were now trapped in a steel coffin, hundreds of feet beneath a frozen ocean, waiting to be rescued, or waiting to die. Still, some families clung to a small sliver of the Kursk, after all, wasn't just any submarine. It was Russia's crown jewel, enormous, longer than 2 football fields, and built like a tank. It had been designed with the most advanced steel hull ever constructed, one that could take a direct torpedo hit and continue on its mission. Its interior was state-of-the-art. The vessel was built to survive the unthinkable. If any submarine could keep its crew alive while stranded at the bottom of the sea, it was the Kursk. That hope, however fragile, was all they had. But what no one on the surface yet realized was that hope was already running out. Beneath the ice-cold surface of the Barents Sea, a nightmare had already begun. In the days that followed the Russian government's televised reassurance, something felt off. Despite their confident claims, despite promising that the Kursk was stable, that they were in communication with the crew, that power and air were being pumped into the submarine, the vessel never resurfaced. No new footage, no photographs, no proof of life, just silence. A silence that grew heavier with each passing hour. Families waited by their phones, glued to television screens, desperate for updates that never came. The media began to ask sharper questions. If everything was fine, where was the Kursk? Why hadn't it surfaced? Why hadn't even a single crew member been recovered? In the absence of new information, panic replaced patience and speculation filled the vacuum. Whispers of technical malfunction began to sound like cover-ups. Was it really just a minor issue with one of the systems on board? Or was something far more catastrophic being hidden from view? The truth would finally begin to surface. 9 days later, on August 21st, 2000, a Norwegian dive team brought in to assist the Russians in the recovery efforts made their descent into the frigid black waters of the Barents Sea. Equipped with high-pressure suits and specialized tools, they navigated to the shattered hull of the Kursk and found their way to one of the submarine's escape hatches, a watertight chamber designed to allow passage in or out without flooding the vessel. They breached the hatch and entered a tomb. What the divers saw inside the Kursk was not a crew waiting calmly for rescue, as the government had suggested. It was devastation. And as they moved deeper into the wreckage, the picture grew darker. While many of the precise details of what occurred aboard the Kursk remain controversial, classified, or debated even to this day, one part of the story has emerged with chilling clarity. That part begins in the 9th compartment. The Kursk, like most large submarines, was divided into a series of watertight sections, 9 in total. Compartment 1 housed the torpedo room at the very front. From there, it continued through living quarters, control areas, and the engine room, all the way back to compartment 9, which sat at the very rear of the submarine. And we know what happened in that final compartment, not because of sonar, not because of rescue logs, but because of a man, a 27-year-old officer named Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. Dmitry came from a long line of submariners. His father had served beneath the sea, and his grandfather before him. As a boy, he idolized their bravery and stoicism, and from a young age, he had only one dream: to serve aboard a submarine like them. By the late 1990s, Dmitry's dream was a reality. He had earned his commission in the Russian Navy and was stationed aboard its most prized vessel, the Kursk. Just 4 months before the fateful training exercise in the Barents Sea, Dmitry had married a schoolteacher named Olga. Their love was young, full of energy and optimism. One of the first things Dmitry did as a newlywed was take Olga on a tour of his beloved submarine. She brought a camera and filmed the cramped corridors, the pressure valves, the steel walls, and her smiling husband proudly showing it all off. He had everything he had ever wanted. On August 12th, as the war games commenced, Dmitri and 117 other crew members were in position aboard the Kursk. At 11:27 a.m., the captain radioed Admiral Popov to confirm they were preparing to fire 2 dummy torpedoes as part of the exercise. Permission was granted. At the front of the sub, deep in compartment 1, the torpedo crew began the loading procedure. But among the torpedoes stored in that room, one was not a dummy. One was live, armed with enough power to destroy a ship in an instant. And then, something went terribly wrong. Dmitri, stationed far away in compartment 7, the engine room, was overseeing routine mechanical checks with his men. As far as they knew, the operation was proceeding normally. But then, a deafening crash, a jolt. The submarine lurched violently to one side, as if struck by an unseen force. Pipes groaned, tools clattered to the floor. The lights flickered. In the torpedo room, one of the real, live torpedoes had malfunctioned and detonated. The explosion was catastrophic, but the Kursk held. Its thick reinforced hull, designed to endure direct hits, remained intact. Fire erupted. Systems failed. But the sub, miraculously, was not yet lost. In the engine room, chaos erupted. Alarms wailed. Smoke began to seep through the ventilation ducts. Dmitri, stunned but composed, immediately began issuing orders. He directed his men to follow emergency protocol, sealing the watertight doors to compartment 6 in front of them and compartment 8 behind. By doing this, they hoped to isolate the damage and prevent flooding, should any exist. But the smoke kept coming. And then, the second explosion. It was far worse. As the fire from the first blast spread through the forward compartments, it ignited several more live torpedoes in quick succession. The resulting chain reaction was apocalyptic. This time, the hull did rupture. The front half of the submarine was instantly obliterated. The men in compartments 1 through 5 were killed either by the blast themselves or drowned moments later as the frigid Arctic water tore through the steel wreckage. But in compartments 6 through 9, the men survived. Badly shaken, thrown to the floor, covered in smoke and debris, but alive. The Kursk, its control tower destroyed, was now a drifting hulk plummeting downward toward the ocean floor, nose first. Inside compartment 7, Dmitri and his surviving crewmates clung to rails and piping, trying to brace against the gut-wrenching descent. The lights were likely gone or flickering. The air, thick with smoke, the sounds of groaning metal and rushing water pressing in from all sides. And they knew they were trapped. Some of them would soon make their way to the 9th compartment, the rearmost section of the submarine. It was there that Dmitri Kolesnikov would write a message. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after the first explosion rocked the Kursk, the submarine slammed nose first into the ocean floor, nearly 350 feet below the surface. The impact sent a tremor through the steel hull, and moments later, the rear half of the vessel settled awkwardly behind it. The Kursk had come to rest, but for the men inside, the nightmare had just begun. We'll never know exactly what happened during those first 2 hours after the Kursk hit the seafloor, but what we do know paints a haunting picture. The vessel still had power. The lights were on. The air purification system was working. It wasn't comfortable. Smoke, chemicals, fear, but it was breathable. Survivable. Somewhere in that window, Dmitri Kolesnikov and the men in his compartment heard it. Banging. Rhythmic. Desperate. Coming from the direction of compartment 6. They had sealed the watertight doors, just like protocol demanded. But protocol didn't account for this. That banging was the sound of survivors. Crewmen, trapped on the other side, pounding their fists into the steel, hoping someone was still alive to hear them. And Dmitri did. He made a decision that no manual could guide. He broke protocol. He ordered the door to compartment 6 opened. And when it creaked wide, they were met with a chilling sight. Rising water. The compartment was flooding fast, and anyone forward of that, compartments 1 through 5, were already lost. By 1:30 p.m., with floodwaters creeping through cracks and seams like icy fingers, the surviving crew in compartment 7 had no choice but to retreat, first into compartment 8, then finally into compartment 9, the rearmost section of the Kursk, their final refuge. But even there, they knew the truth. They were cornered. The walls that had once kept the sea at bay were now scarred and leaking, riddled with holes from the earlier explosions. The watertight doors, meant to save them, had become delaying tactics, and the water was winning. Despite the claustrophobic darkness, the creaking hull, and the rising flood, Dmitri stayed calm, unshakably calm. He reached into his uniform and pulled out a piece of paper. There, among the 22 other doomed sailors huddled in the back of a dying submarine, he wrote a message. He dated it, August 12th, 15:15 p.m. And then, in neat, steady handwriting, he began to describe what had happened. He mentioned the explosion, the compartment they were trapped in, and how they were waiting for rescue. He wrote that he believed he and the 22 men with him were the only survivors. He noted that they had considered escaping through the emergency hatch, but it hadn't worked. Dmitri folded the note and placed it carefully in his breast pocket. For the next hour and a half, they waited in silence. Then the lights went out. The temperature dropped rapidly. With no power, the heating system failed, and the freezing waters of the Barents Sea began to creep into the compartment. The men, now shivering and blind in the pitch black, could hear the sound of the submarine's final breath, the slow, steady seep of water through ruptured seams. Dmitri reached for the note again. He added a second message. This time, his handwriting was barely legible, the result of hypothermia, of writing in complete darkness, of hands that could barely grip a pen. He even wrote, "I'm writing blind," to make it clear. The lights were gone. Hope was gone. In this final edition, he acknowledged what they all knew. They weren't going to make it, and with the last bit of strength he had, he said goodbye. He addressed his wife, his family. He told them not to despair. His final words on the note were, "Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov." Then he folded the note one last time and tucked it back into his pocket. And in the darkness, as the cold closed in and the water climbed the walls, Dmitri and the 22 men around him waited. We don't know if they whispered prayers, or if they held hands, or if they simply sat in silence, but we do know they stayed together, and eventually, they were gone. Experts estimate that the entire Kursk was fully flooded within 8 hours of the first explosion. But here's what makes it even more tragic. They could have been saved. The Russian Navy had detected the second explosion. 2 separate ships, including the one carrying Admiral Popov, heard and felt it, but no one acted. They dismissed it. When the Kursk failed to respond to calls after announcing their torpedo test, they chalked it up to a radio malfunction. By the time the Russian military realized something was seriously wrong, the Kursk had been missing for hours. And even then, the response was agonizingly slow. It took more time to organize a rescue effort, and when submersibles were finally deployed, they couldn't latch onto the escape hatch. Even if the men inside were still alive, they couldn't be reached. Foreign offers of help, from Britain, Norway, the US, were initially rejected. Pride, politics, bureaucracy, while men sat trapped in a metal coffin below the sea. It wasn't until 9 days later that Russia finally accepted international assistance. And by then, it was far too late. When the Norwegian dive team opened the escape hatch and climbed into the Kursk, they were met with silence and seawater. The submarine was fully flooded. Bodies floated in the corridors. The cold had taken them all. And there, inside Dmitri Kolesnikov's uniform, they found the note. Folded, preserved, final. In the aftermath, Russia awarded the Order of Courage to the entire crew of the Kursk. Each family received 10 years' salary, housing in any Russian city, and guaranteed college education for their children. But for many, none of that mattered. No amount of compensation could undo the loss, or the knowledge that rescue had been possible, if only the response had come faster. What remains is a story of silence, of sacrifice, and of a man who, facing certain death in the black belly of the sea, still found the strength to write a message not of fear, but of love. No need to despair.